There's been a lot of bad press lately on over-tourism in Japan, with reports of tourists behaving badly to the point that the Japanese, who are famously polite, are finally getting fed up. For example, there's a famous Lawson near Mount Fuji, which has become a real Instagram hotspot. But locals finally got sick of the hordes of selfie-seeking tourists clogging up the area, and now a screen has been constructed to block the view of Mount Fuji. So while I was in Japan, I asked a few locals if they were really getting sick of tourists. Of course, I was a tourist myself, so I didn't expect anyone to say to my face that they didn't like me, especially given the legendary Japanese politeness. And generally, the response I got was everything was fine and they have no problem with tourists. But when I pressed a bit further and mentioned some of the bad press I was seeing, they did start to open up a bit and acknowledge there were a few bad apples, but overall it wasn't a major problem. When I asked for some specific examples of bad tourist behavior, I got a couple interesting comments. The first one was litter. So, something that shocks many first time visitors to Japan is how there are practically no public trash bins anywhere. This is partly due to 1. Culture, where Japanese are accustomed to just taking their trash with them and disposing at home, 2. Maintenance, to save on the cost and hassle of maintaining public trash cans, and 3. Public safety, in response to the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo metro in 1995, which was a domestic terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 13 people. So after that, trash bins were mostly removed to prevent them from being used to store weapons. So I guess the lack of trash bins comes as a surprise to some visitors, and instead of taking their garbage with them, they instead just leave it lying around. So if you're visiting Japan, don't litter. Another example I got was toilet hygiene. Japan is renowned for clean and technologically advanced toilets, and it's not uncommon for toilets to have built-in bidets and heated seats, even in public places. Japanese take their toilet hygiene seriously, and this might be stating the obvious, but clean up after yourself when using the toilet, and always remember to flush. One person I talked to specifically mentioned not flushing as an example of bad tourist behavior. So overall, the responses I got were quite mild, and I recognized that due to the legendary Japanese politeness, I may not be getting the full story from the people I talked to. That begs the question then, is Japanese politeness fake? Well, it depends on what you mean by fake. If you mean fake, as in, are Japanese just pretending to be nice and smiley when they actually are annoyed, then I would say yes. Sometimes it can be hard to tell how a Japanese person is really feeling since their default behavior is to be nice and polite. But that is an important and authentic part of Japanese culture. So it's not fake in the sense that it really is part of Japanese culture to be nice and polite and maintain social harmony. Okay, now it's time to get deep. The follow up question then is, why are Japanese so mild mannered and polite? And how did it become such an important part of their culture? It might be hard to believe now, but Japan was responsible for some of the worst war atrocities in human history, most notably the Nanjing Massacre in the late 1930s, where essentially the entire Chinese city of Nanjing was brutally raped, tortured, and killed. Now, I won't go into the details of the brutality here, but it was so bad that a Nazi known as John Rabe, who was stationed at Nanjing at the time, was shocked at what he was witnessing and begged the Japanese to stop, and even wrote a letter to Hitler asking Hitler to persuade the Japanese to stop. So if even the Nazis think what you're doing is sick, then something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. But props, I guess, to Nazi John Rabe, who has since been credited for saving more than 250,000 lives. And if the Nanjing massacre wasn't enough, another Japanese wartime atrocity was the use of comfort women, essentially a euphemism for sex slave, where foreign women, mostly from Korea, were sex trafficked into Japan to work in military brothels during World War II. And again, I won't go into the details here, but there are stories of women being forcibly raped up to 40 times per day. And while military brothels existed since the early 1930s, their use was expanded following international shock at the Nanjing massacre, but not because the Japanese were repenting for their sins, but more to protect their own image, and keep their mass raping within their own borders. So the shift from raping and pillaging to comfort women was largely due to Eastern shame based face saving culture, as opposed to remorse, which is something I'll come back to later. So, how on earth did one of the most barbaric people in the world become one of the most polite people in the world in a span of 1 to 2 generations? That's like if Al Qaeda went from orchestrating 9/11 and beheading hostages, which you can argue is not even as bad as what the Japanese did, to full on Kawaii and Hello Kitty. Well, I think there are a couple reasons. First is that Japan is the only country in the world to have ever been nuked in an act of war, and they got nuked not once, but twice, forcing the unconditional surrender of Japan in World War II just days later. Think about what kind of impact this would have on the national psyche and ego. Japan was a country that had huge global power ambitions when they entered World War II, and they actually had the balls to attack the US in Pearl Harbor. Now, keep in mind that the US was already the most powerful country in the world at this point and wasn't even in World War II yet, and was only after the attack on Pearl Harbor that the US decided to enter the war. So it's crazy to think how brazen Japan was in its attack. They really thought they could take on the US and show them who's boss, but obviously it backfired spectacularly on them. So think about how you could go from having the balls to take on the US to getting nuked to oblivion. Think of how emasculating and humbling that must be. That's not just tail between the legs humbling. That's like tail between the legs and letting yourself get on type of humbling. So it's really no surprise that getting nuked has caused such a massive change to the Japanese national psyche. The second reason I would say Japanese became so polite is that it's a coping mechanism for all the atrocities they have committed but refuse to acknowledge. To this day, Japan has not properly apologized for the Nanjing massacre and the use of comfort women, at least not to the satisfaction of many of the victims, and not to the extent the Germans have apologized for the Holocaust. So rather than apologize and admit fault, the Japanese respond by doing a complete 180 in terms of their behavior to make the world forget that they ever committed atrocities, which they largely have been successful at doing amongst the Western world, and that might include you watching if you didn't know about the Nanjing massacre or comfort women before. In the Eastern world, though, a lot of Chinese and Koreans, particularly amongst the older generation, still harbor a lot of resentment and distrust towards Japanese. So, why would Japan so drastically change their collective behavior rather than apologize for past sins and promise to do better? I think it's to do with the shame based face saving culture I mentioned earlier. As opposed to Western cultures, which generally place more value on the individual and personal responsibility, Eastern cultures are generally more collectivist and place more value on the group and social harmony. So there's this constant pressure to not make the group look bad. So admitting fault to the outside world is seen as almost a betrayal to the group and will result in a loss of face with other members of the group and negatively impact your social standing within it. So just as comfort women were a face-saving response to the Nanjing massacre, I would argue Japanese politeness today is an extreme face-saving response to the war atrocities in general, where Japanese know they effed up and did some really bad things in the past, but rather than own up to it, they have instead completely changed their behavior as a subconscious way to prove to themselves and others that they are not bad people. Just to clarify, I'm not at all saying Japanese are bad people, and today they really are some of the nicest and most well mannered people you'll meet. But it is interesting to think that the Japanese people you meet today, who are always smiling and bowing, may have had a completely different demeanor just a couple generations ago. But what do you think? Is Japanese politeness real or fake? Let me know in the comments below. And if you do travel to Japan, remember, don't litter, and for the love of John Rabe, always flush the toilet. Thanks for watching. See you next time.